Well, hello, it's Mauricio Bonifacino again. In this presentation, I'm going to present you a brief summary of the Cinicioni. So first, I'm going to say something about the distribution and diversity of the Cinicioni. Then I'm going to present the defining features of the tribe, comment a little bit on its phylogenetic context, and then give some examples of main groups. This is a large tribe. So before actually starting to talk about the Cinicione, I want to say just a couple of words about what I think is the modern father of the Cinicione. So the person that by means of analyzing the morphology, he recircumscribed the tribe, and that is none other than Bert Nordenstam. He is a remarkable man from Sweden, and he is a person that has a long experience of working in the family in many tribes, but he is definitely in the Cinicione that he will be, forever remembered. So if we just let me digress a little bit and share with you a little bit of the history of the concepts of the Cinicione. So the Cinicione was as it happened with other tribes defined by Cassini in 1829. Is when he finally, in addition to the Cinicione, he also added other two tribes, Adenostilinae and Tucilaginii. Those are tribes that Cassini defined that eventually researchers joined with the Cinicione. Later on, Lessing in 1832 added to that definition of Cassini the Antimidi, the Calenduli, and the whole Helianti alliance. All of this in a broadly defined Cinicione. As Harold Robinson liked to say, well, you got to understand that Lessing was 23 years old by the time he did that. So he always liked to make jokes about the age of Lessing back in those early days. The Candolle, for the most part, took the treatment of Lessing more or less unchanged. Bentham removed the Antimidi, the Calenduli, and a good deal of the Helianti alliance, and but he also added to that broadly defined Cinicione the Liabi. And that was basically the scheme of Hoffman. And that will be a definition of Cinicione that will go well into the 20th century. It was not until the first international meeting, the Compositae meeting in Reading in 1975, that an alternative proposal were presented. Actually, two proposals. One by Turner and Powell, in which, in addition to the original definition by Cassini, they also wanted to add some of the members of the Helianti alliance, mostly the what is known as the Helinoid clades. But in that same meeting, there was an alternative proposal, the one by Bertil Nordenstam. Nordenstam had reviewed all the groups in much detail, and his system was the one who eventually was followed. And it has been since then the system that has been used and the circumscription. That's why I consider Nordenstam the modern father of the Cinicione. If we look at the distribution of the Cinicione is the largest tribe in the Compositae. If we don't consider the microspecies in the Cicorii, the largest tribe by far is the Cinicione. They are everywhere. But you could see that there are like three centers of diversity. You know, the most important one is in South Africa. Then we have one in the northwestern Andes, and one in Mexico. And you could consider one also in Southeastern Asia as well. But the most important centers of diversity will be South Africa, Northwestern South America, and Mexico. The numbers, this is from a paper by Pelser et al. From 2007, where the numbers represent the number of genera in each of those political divisions. If we look at the genetic diversity, taking into consideration the different subtribes currently recognized in the Cinicioni, this is the scenario. As you see, there are three main subtribes, the Tusilagini, the Ottonini, and the Cinicioni, which is by far the largest, still dominated by a mega genus Senecio. In gray at the bottom left, you see Aprozanella and Doronicon. Those are two rather unusual groups in the Cinicioni that represent two lineages that are subsequently sister to the rest of the Cinicioni, and will most likely be considered as different subtribes in the Cinicioni. So I mentioned that the Cinicione is the largest tribe in the Compositae, so with over 3,500 species. If we represent all that diversity with a bar, with the red part on the left, that's Senecio, just one genus accounting for 35% of the species. And the tiny bar of dark gray on the right, those are the monotypic genera that represent 31% of the genetic diversity and only a little bit over 1% of the species diversity. So it is a very peculiar tribe in how it is organized in terms of the subordinate taxa. I found that rather interesting. Okay, so what are the defining features of the Cinicioni? So the Cinicioni, it's a tribe mostly of herbaceous plants, but we have some trees as well. The heads could vary. I'm going to show you some examples now of different sort of capitula that we could have in the Cinicioni. But one very distinctive feature is that the filaries are in a single row. That is a very, very characteristic feature. The style is usually truncated with an apical tuft of trichomes. Even when there's variation, we could say that a considerable amount of Cinicioni, follow this pattern. The stigma is in two marginal bands, although we'll see that there's variation here as well. And the calcium oxalate is absent from akene walls. So let's see some of those defining features. So here it's a close-up of a head of Senecio icoglossus in the subtribe Senecionini. And there you see a truncated style with an apical tuft of collecting trichomes. This is by no means universal in the tribe, but most of the group have this sort of style. Then another of the defining features is that the stigma is in two marginal bands. That, again, for the most part of the Cinicioni. And then another interesting trait is the baluster-formed filaments. You could see how the filament is thickened, in that part of the anther collar very noticeably. So together, those traits tell you Cinicioni. So here are some examples of different type of styles in the Cinicioni from an illustration of the classic work by Nordenstam from 1978. So what I painted in red here is the commonest type of style in the Cinicioni. The truncate type with an apical tuft of trichomes and the stigma in two marginal bands. But we could also have a truncate stigma and a truncate style with a continuous stigmatic surface. That is something that we are going to find mostly in the Tusilagini subtribe. Then we could also have, instead of the, if you look on the images on the left part, we could have, instead of the truncate style branch, we could have with a triangular appendage. And that could be associated to forms with continuous stigma or to forms with in which the stigma is distributed in two marginal bands. There's a subtribe in the Cinicione which is characterized by these florets having styles that are undivided. That is the subtribe Otoninini. Then we have this other trait, the anther filaments, that I already mentioned, the baluster form, which is common for a good deal of Cinicioni, and then the cylindric type. Other of the traits that we are going to see that vary in the tribe are the endothelial cell wall thickenings. So we could have cell wall thickenings happening in the in all the periphery of the cells, and that is the radial pattern, or we could have them in just the opposite ends. If we look at the phylogeny of the Cinicione, we see three rather large subtribes. Well, two very large, which is the Cinicione and the Tusilagini, and then the Otonini. And if you see the first divergent lineages are Doronicum and Aprozanella in the upper part of the tree. Those are, I believe that they will be described as subtribes. So here we see the distribution of how the style branches are. So look how the Otonini are those that have the style branches undivided, and then the Cinicione, it's the subtribe in which the stigma is in two bands, and the Tusilagini, the subtribe in which the stigma is continuous. If we look at this is from a phylogeny by Pelzer et al. From 2007. If we look at this other trait, the endothelial cells thickenings, we could see how the Cinicioni and the Otoninini have both a radial pattern, while the Tusilagini have polarized pattern. If we look at the shape of the anther filament, Otonini and Cinicione are baluster form, and then Tusilagini is cylindric. So very, very interesting and easy to see pattern across the tribe. So here we have an example of a radiate head typical of the Cinicione. In this case of Senecio bonariensis. So this is a typical radiate capitulum, very common in many Cinicioni. Well, we have marginal florets with true ray corollas, and these florets with tubulose corollas. Then other type of capitulum that we could have in the Cinicione is the Discoid type, like in this case of Senecio viravira, with only these florets bearing tubulose corollas, and you could see there on the florets the style branches just coming up, and you can see the truncate shape and the tuft of trichomes in the apex. Another type of capitulum that we could have is the deciform. So the deciform capitulum, in this case in the genus Aprozanella, where you could see these florets with tubulose corolla, and on the periphery you can see the marginal florets with filiform corollas. So you could almost see that those florets that are on the periphery are of a different size also. So this is what a deciform capitula will look like. Here we have another Cenicio celoi. And I wanted to show this image because it shows a trait that is very important in the identification of different groups in the Cinicione, which is well, there you could see the nature of the involucre of filaries in one series. And then you can see an important structure that I was just referring to, that is very important for the identification of a species in the Cinicione, which is the caliculus. You can see that there's very good differentiation between the involucre, that in this case is 138, that's a defining feature of Cinicione, and the caliculus. They have different shapes and they are arranged differently as well. So that is an important character to look for. The different species of Cinicione could either have caliculus or the caliculus could be absent. And how developed and the size of the bracts, those are also important characters. Here is a close-up of a fruiting head in a Senecio, where you could see some of the defining features of the largest genus in the Cinicione. Remember that 1/3 of the tribe is Senecio, and these are the traits of the fruits and the pappus of most of those Senecios. The achenes or the cypsellas are fusiform to oblong, ribbed, usually with 8 to 10 ribs, and with trichomes in between the ribs. And the pappus is made of capillary bristles that could be deciduous or not. So here is an example of the other subtribe, the Tussilagini, with a very important genus in the northwestern Andes, which is Hynoxis. And one of the defining features of Hynoxis is the opposite and discolorous leaves that we could see in this image. But we could also see here that the style with the triangular sterile appendage. You could see how it's triangular and tiny, and it gets thinner towards the apex. So that's a typical style of the Tussilagini. Well, here just to show some odd examples in the whole tribe. This is the Otoninini. This is actually the genus Otona. These are the succulent Cinicioni from South Africa. Very bizarre and interesting looking plant. In some places, like in Patagonia, the Cinicios could constitute a dominant element in the vegetation. In this case, with Senecio filaginoides, I believe, in Patagonia. Or, like this case of Dendrocinicio in Africa, where you could have a Cinicione with a tree habit. Very, very interesting growth forms. And you have some tiny herbs as well, like this example of the genus Werneria, the genus that the late Vicky Funk used to study for quite a while. And here you have one of the defining features of Werneria, the fused filaries. That's not just of Werneria, but a few genera have that, but that's definitely a defining feature of this genus. And also of a genus that Vicky described that was previously considered part of Werneria, which is the genus Xenophilum, where you could see also the fused filaries. And this just shows an example that not all Senecios have tiny leaves. Some can have, very, very monumental leaves like these that are almost 170 centimeters long. This is Senecio madfeldianus, and you can see there with the inflorescence almost reaches 4 meters high, the plant. And this is a close-up of one of these group of Cinicioni that at one point was considered to be in a tribe of its own, but now it's going to be considered a subtribe in the Cinicioni, which is the genus Aprozanella. And one of the defining features of Aprozanella is that the corollas are actinomorphic and are four-lobed. That's very unusual. And with that, with this image of Cinicio from Patagonia with deciform heads, I thank you for your attention.